We moved here from Baton Rouge, Louisiana in March, and so we're happy to be with you. And so Bobby's out of town or something this week, and so Pat asked me if I would fill in, so I agreed to do that. About a year ago at my old church in Baton Rouge, I taught a series of lessons called Know Why You Believe. And the Apostle Peter, in his first epistle, encourages us to always be ready to give an answer to anybody who has a question, has an inquiry about our Christian faith. And so we are charged to be able to give a reason for our belief. Our belief is not something that's arbitrary. It's not something that's just made up. It's not just something that's vacuous, but there is a foundation, there's a basis for our faith. And it is a reasonable faith. We can't prove Christianity, but we do have good grounds for believing Christianity, for having the faith that we have. And it's, I think, getting more and more challenging in our world, as our world seems to be moving in a secular direction, just to present the Christian faith without any grounds for it. And so I think we need to be able to say, okay, here are some reasons why I believe. And so so this is just one of those lessons. This is a lesson about how does archaeology confirm Scripture? How can it be used as one of the reasons, one of the many reasons that we can have for believing that the Bible is accurate, that it is historical, that it is trustworthy. Next slide, please. So, before we really get into the heart of the talk, I want to just give a little bit of a background, a little bit of direction about where we're going. In the past 200 years, archaeology has made a lot of discoveries. It's made discoveries about biblical geography, about towns, cities, mountains, rivers, all of those things. If you read the Bible, you don't know where they are. So archaeology has filled in, it's supported all of that material in the Bible that we might call geography. And so that's one of the things geography is helpful for about. Secondly, archaeology has verified, it's confirmed a number of the events and a number of the people who are mentioned in the Bible. It's provided external references and grounded the validity of our faith in these people as historical people, in these events as historical events. Now, next slide, please. So in this talk, this is a huge area, and there's a lot of material out there, so I can't possibly cover it. So I'm just going to sample some various key findings of archaeology over the years, in the past 250 years or so. And I'm going to also try to include some fairly recent discoveries in archaeology, just to give you some flavor of what we can learn about the Bible and about Scripture from archaeology. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture of the divided kingdom. And so we can, maps are another thing that archaeology gives us. It tells us where things were, and so we can make maps of them. And so we're going back here about 1,000 years to the reign of David and shortly thereafter. And not long after the United Kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon, the kingdom divided. David ruled about 1000 BC, roughly speaking. And so this is about 100 years later when the kingdom divided, and you see the two Israelite kingdoms. You see Judah in the south here in red, and you see Israel in the north in green. And so if you can read it on the map, there's a city called Bethel at the bottom of the green. That's the southern limit. And there's a city in the north called Dan, which was settled by the tribe of Dan. You can read about they're moving up there in the book of Judges. And they're right on the top, and they are right on the bound border of a country called Aram. That would be current Syria. And it was a kingdom whose capital was Damascus, and they were frequent wars between Israel, the northern kingdom, and Aram. And Judah sometimes got involved. So Dan here is right on the border of the two, and it got caught up in the wars sometimes. Next slide, please. So something that has been found, something that was discovered in 1993, which is fairly recent, is something called the Tel Dan, the House of David find. And it's a commemoration from an Aramaic king, a Syrian king who fought against two of the Israelite kings, the northern king, whose name is given there, Jehoram, and the southern king, whose name is not given, the king of the southern kingdom, Judah, but who has said that he is from the house of David. Now this is very interesting because this is the first really archaeological mention of David that's been found. And there are this school of minimalists who believe a minimal amount about the scripture, and they even conjectured that David was a myth. And so this confirmed that David was really a person. As a matter of fact, here we find 100 years later this battle taking place, and the king of Judah is mentioned as being of the house of David, referring back to somebody who's clearly pretty well known. And so David is well established here as a figure. Now, that rock just looks like a rock, I know, but there's really writing on it where this Aramaic king has written there about his victory over the kingdoms of Judah and the kingdoms of Israel. And he mentions in Judah that he has been victorious over the house of David. Next slide, please. All right, here's another map. So we're going to move down the road about 100 or 200 years and look at the Assyrian Empire, which flourished from 892 BC to 648 BC, a long period of time. It had ups and downs over this period, but for much of this period, it was the most powerful kingdom in the world, and it had conquered major territories in what we call the Near East. And if you look on the map there, you can see Assyria there is kind of in that upper region there. You can see the Fertile Crescent there, kind of in a darker yellow. And so Assyria is basically where Iraq and southeast Turkey is today. It covers that region. And their capital was Nineveh, and they had very powerful armies, very powerful kings and leaders. And so they're an important part of the Israelite story. And we read about invasions of Assyria into the northern kingdom of Israel and even into the southern kingdom of Judah in the Old Testament historical accounts. Next slide, please. So there's something very interesting here. The Assyrians, each year, they would appoint some important official, maybe the king sometimes, I don't know, and they would name that year the year of. You know, like the Chinese do the year of the tiger and the year of the rat and the year of the dragon. Well, they named the year of as Bibophel or something. You know, whatever the name of that famous official was, they would name it that year. And these people for whom the year was named were called Lemmus. And so there have been found in the archaeological remains of the Assyrian capital Nineveh and the regions around there have been heavily investigated by archaeologists. There's been a lot of digs in that area. They found a lot of information, and they found a chronological Lemmu list. So this list, for a big line of one, who was the first Lemmu, who was the second, who was the third, etc. And so every year, if you were somebody that was somebody, you would get your name on, you'd be a Lemmu and you'd get your name on the Lemmu list. But importantly, it's chronological. Now what's amazing, in one of these lists, they mention an eclipse of the sun. 763 BC. The astronomers can date when all the eclipses of the sun were by working backwards with the astronomy. And so they mention in the year of such and such Limu, we had an eclipse of the sun. Well, okay. We know we can figure out when that eclipse of the sun was, 763, and so you see the Limu that went there, and so you can date that Limu, and then you can date everybody in the list because they changed every year, right? So this was a marvelous find, and it allowed us to fix the chronology of the Assyrians with our chronology. But beyond that, the Assyrians had battles, they had interactions with with the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom over various times, and we can we can find those mentioned in the Assyrian records. So we can find when certain dates in the Old Testament occurred through this Limu list. And this has been very important in allowing us to verify and date events in the Old Testament. Next slide, please. So, so the Assyrians had powerful armies, as I said. They invaded Israel. They had fights with Israel. They conquered the northern kingdom eventually. And so their records of these conflicts and their mention of these biblical characters help us to confirm the existence of these people historically and to date when those events that are recorded in the Old Testament took place, especially those events that involved interaction between the Assyrians and the Israelite people. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's one of the things. Here's something that's been found in these Assyrian excavations. This is called the Black Obelisk, and this is in the palaces of the Assyrian kings. They had these big rooms with all kinds of decorations and friezes and other things. And so this is a stone sculpture, and it's showing one of the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, King Jehu, who is bringing tribute. He's been invaded by the Assyrians. He's been beaten in battle, and now he's bringing tribute to King Shalmaneser of Assyria. And we can use the Limu list to date this to 841 BC. And here he is. It shows him bowing down. You see him there in the middle, bowing down to Shalmaneser and offering his homage as well as his payments to the king. And this is the only picture we have of a known Israelite person from the old Israelite kingdom. So makes this interesting. Next slide, please. This picture of Jehu. Okay, another interaction of the Assyrians with the Israelite people was when King Sennacherib invaded both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom somewhere around 800, somewhere around 800 BC. And so, I was right first. It was around 700 BC that he did this. So he came down, he brought a huge army, he invaded the southern kingdom of Judea. The northern kingdom had already been destroyed by this time, and he was trying to capture the southern kingdom. And so he invaded this city south of Jerusalem called Lachish, and and then he tried to go back and capture Jerusalem and capture Hezekiah, who was king there. And so he mentions Hezekiah, and he mentioned that he trapped him in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. But if you know the biblical story, that yes, they surrounded the city, yes, things were desperate, but Hezekiah went to the temple and he prayed to God, and God sent the angel of death and destroyed most of the Assyrian army. Now, for some reason, Sennacherib doesn't mention that in his records, but they fled back, and it's interesting that he just mentions that he caught Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, but he doesn't say anything about winning the city. He doesn't say anything about his troops being destroyed. He doesn't say anything about going back to Nineveh and never going out to fight again. So this is you get different you get different stories from different sides, right? Okay, next slide, please. So so Sennacherib, in his walls of his palace, made these fancy murals, or whatever you want to call them. And this is the one of the siege of Lachish, or Lachish. This is the siege of that city. They did capture and destroy that city. And can you see how things are slanting? I hope you can see it a little bit. See how things are slanting up like this, and there are soldiers marching up them? Well, they built ramps up. They built ramps up to get to the top of the wall. And so these are curved here. They probably may not have been this steep, but they were ramps that sloped up to the top of the wall, and then the army would march up them and get over the wall. So you can see in this picture, you can see Assyrian soldiers, well-armed, marching up. Down here toward the bottom, you see some people who are apparently captive, and they've been nailed to the wall. Woo. And then there's another little bunch of people that look like they're trying to escape the city. So this is a real-life picture of this battle that's mentioned briefly in the Old Testament. Next slide, please. All right, so now we talked about Hezekiah. Another thing that Hezekiah is known for is Hezekiah's tunnel. And so at some stage, probably because he was afraid of sieges and wanted to have a water supply, and the normal water supply for Jerusalem was outside the walls, so he built this tunnel to bring water into the city. And you can see the sides of the tunnel there. There's somebody holding a light way down at the end of the tunnel there. Maybe you can see them. And 2 Kings 20 summarizes Hezekiah's life like this. All the other events of Hezekiah's reign, all of his achievements, and how he made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city, are they not written? So this tunnel was discovered back in the 1800s. It was a huge discovery, and it's still one of the most popular things to see if you go to Jerusalem today. You can visit Hezekiah's tunnel. Now what's amazing was I just was reading, and just in the last year, they've discovered a little piece of stone there, and it has just a little bit of writing on it that they can read. And it says, it looks like it says, a little bit of it is destroyed. It looks like it says Hezekiah's pool. And so the conjecture is that he actually wrote this scroll to commemorate building this pool that is mentioned here in this verse. And so the team of scholars are still evaluating this, but it looks like if this is right, this is the only mention that we have where some Israelite king mentions some in a monument. On a monument, he inscribes that monument that he's the one who built it. So apparently Hezekiah did put this monument up where this was called Hezekiah's pool. Next slide, please. All right, this is the Ketef Hinnon silver scrolls. Now there's a famous valley right outside Jerusalem called the Valley of Hinnon, and that was discovered in some tombs. This little scroll was. The Valley of Hinnon later in the New Testament becomes Gehenna, and it's kind of becomes a picture for hell, because eventually at some stage this valley became the city dump for Jerusalem. But so this was discovered in the 7th century BC. They can tell that by the other artifacts that they found in this tomb, and also by the writing on it. The writing was like the writing, they wrote the Hebrew letters like they did at this period of time. And so there's this verse from Numbers, this famous blessing that occurs there in Numbers 6. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh cause his face to shine upon you and grant you peace. And this scroll, this little bit of writing, it was kind of a child's bracelet, and it was wrapped up, and they've unwrapped the bracelet here, and the writing is written on the outside of it, or inside of it. And this scroll contains the oldest portion of Scripture found outside the Bible. This dates back to about 600, 7th century. And it's also the oldest oldest reference external to the Bible that mentions Israel. So it was quite a find, and as you see, it's not too old, 79 AD. And so this is just
that moved the record of scrolls that we had back 1,000 years. Now this writing is moving it back another 500 years. And again, it confounded some of the liberal scholars because they thought that a lot of including these books was written after the exile. But here we see that you have Hebrew writing of Scripture that's being preserved as early as again is interesting confirming of Scripture as we have. And then, as I said, that this is it's amazingly close to what we find in the today. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is the Cyrus cylinder. It was found in Babylon. And in this,
Cyrus captured Babylon. He was the one that captured Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, Babylon, and so after he did it, after he captured them, at some point he wrote this scroll, and it's found there, the Cyrus scroll. And in this scroll, he grants the captives freedom to go back to their homeland, to go back to their home cities, and to rebuild as long as they just honor him and pray for him to their gods, that he'll be victorious, that he'll have good health. And so this doesn't directly mention the Israelites, but what's on this scroll is very similar to what we find in Ezra 1, 2, 3, where he gave a similar edict to the captured Jewish people and allowed them to go back to their homes. And he told them to go back, rebuild, and in your temples worship me. And so this is a confirmation that this was consistent with the character of Cyrus, that he would do this kind of thing. Next slide, please. All right, so I'd already mentioned this one. This is the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was an amazing discovery. It was done in the 1940s. The first ones were discovered by an Arab shepherd boy. And so they found hundreds of manuscripts in the caves as they investigate over the years, 12 caves. And as the slide mentions, 230 of these scrolls that they found contained references to the Old Testament. They were Old Testament texts. So every book of the Old Testament is represented in these scrolls except for the book of Esther. Some of the books are just represented with fragments, but almost the whole book of Isaiah has been found in this. And these have been a tremendous help in going back and studying the Old Testament. And what's amazing is, I told you that before they were discovered, the oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament we had dated back to about 1000 AD. This is going back over 1,000 years, and they're finding a remarkable agreement between this record that we had of the Old Testament based on this scroll from 1000 AD and these ones that were 1,000 years earlier. So we can have confidence that our Scripture has been passed on down to us without any major changes taking place, that we have Scriptures that are very close to what were originally written. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we're going to jump to the New Testament now. So here's another fairly recent discovery from 2004. And so there were some workers on a drainage system, and they found these two steps, and they called in archaeologists, and they started digging, and they found this pool that was being here, and they were able to identify it as the Pool of Siloam. And we're familiar with the Pool of Siloam because it's the place where Jesus told the blind factual places. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the Pilate. And so Pilate was mentioned by 2 or 3 ancient writers already, so we had some good basis for this. But this was the first archaeological discovery of anything related to Pilate, with this Pilate stone that they discovered. So this is stone with 2 Pilates. He himself had one. Tiberius was the Roman emperor at this time, and so Pontius Pilate wanted to have some kind of tribute to Tiberius, and so he had this tribute stone prepared honoring the emperor. And then he signed it at the bottom, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. So we see confirmed that he really was a historical figure, prefect, ruler, Roman ruler in this area, and interesting enough, just very recently in 2018, at this same site, they found a copper ring there, which said of Pilatus, or of Pilate. And so there was another confirmation of Pilate at this site, another archaeological confirmation. Next slide, please. Okay, so in 1968, in the northeastern part of Jerusalem, there was a crew that was doing construction work. Actually, the Jewish law, current Jewish law, forbids people from digging up tombs. But so this tomb was accidentally discovered by some workers working on another project. And buried in one of these tombs, they found an adult male in an ossuary, a bone box. So they would take the people's skeletons basically and put them in these boxes. And so they found that his right heel had a spike driven through it. You can see the foot kind of coming out toward us, and toward the back of the foot there you see this spike that's driven through it. And so as they've studied in more detail about crucifixions, they found that it was a common practice to like build at the bottom of, where the feet were of the person to be crucified, to build a little square rectangle. And they would get on one side of the rectangle and nail this spike through, and then they'd nail it through right through that heel area, and then come out the other side of the box. And that way that person's foot would be supported to hold the body up on the cross. Painful things to think about, but anyway, so here is this. Apparently they could not get that nail out of the body when they took it down from the cross, and so this was preserved. In this bone box, this heel was preserved with this spike still in it. So this gives us. It confirms the biblical description of crucifixions. But what's more important archaeologically for us is that it shows that a family could request and receive the body of someone who was crucified, who would be a criminal typically, and that they could take it for burial. Some scholars had conjectured that everybody that was crucified, the Romans wanted to dishonor them as criminals, and so they would just throw their bodies by the road and let the dogs eat them and so forth. And this shows that that was not the universal practice, that families were allowed to take the bodies and bury them in burial sites. So that, again, supports the story that we have about Jesus' body being taken and buried in a burial site. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is a map of Paul's first missionary journey. Now remember, we have these maps because of archaeology, right? Archaeology has told us where all these places are, and they allow us to draw the maps, how to get to one place to another. And so on his first missionary journey, recorded in Acts 13, the first distant place that Barnabas and Paul visited was the island of Cyprus. And you can see the island of Cyprus at the bottom there. You probably can't read it there, but there's a city in the eastern side called Salamis where they landed. They walked across the island, and they came to this city on the western coast called Pampas. All this is down at the bottom there. And there at Pampas, they found that this area was ruled by a Roman ruler. He was a proconsul, and his name was Sergius Paulus. And so Paul and Barnabas were able to preach the gospel to Sergius Paulus. He became a believer, and so that was a very important conversion for Paul on that occasion. Now, there's some interesting things that grow out of this. One is that from history we find out that Sergius Paulus, his home was Antioch of Pisidia. If you look way up there on the top of the map, that's the first place that he went when he crossed on over to Asia Minor. He went on up to Antioch of Pisidia, and that was Sergius Paulus's home area. That's where he grew up before he became proconsul and went down to Cyprus. And so you wonder if Sergius Paulus made a suggestion to Paul that he go up and preach in his home city where his family was. Nobody, we don't know, but it's an interesting idea. The second thing is that it's at this point in the story, when Paul is at Paphos and when Sergius Paulus is converted, that the text changes Saul's name to Paul. Did his using of the name Paul have anything to do with Sergius Paulus? Well, again, we don't know, but it's an interesting idea. Anyway, so archaeology provides this whole map to us in this story. So next slide, please. But there's an inscription here. In 1877, there was an inscription found on the island of Cyprus at this little place called Soli, which was not far from Paphos, where Paul met Sergius Paulus. And there's a pictured inscription on this. I don't know if you might be able barely to read this. There's something here called, some letters will ignore it the first, 6, the number 6. And then there's a P-A, looks like a V, but that's the Latin U, P-A-U-L-L-I-S, Paulus. And then down below is another L, 50. And then there's Serge. You can see S-E-R-G there, Sergius. And so this has the name of Sergius Paulus inscribed on it. And it's, again, it's a good archaeological confirmation of the fact that what we're reading about in the book of Acts about Paul's missionary journey is real history with real people, historical people, and historical events. And so I think this is a very interesting confirmation here. Next slide, please. Okay, so another extremely important inscription in the New Testament days is the Gallio inscription. So the Apostle Paul on his second missionary journey, he spent 1.5 years in the city of Corinth. And as usual, he had a lot of trouble with Jewish agitators and other agitators. And at one case, toward the end of his visit, things reached such a state that Paul was taken before the magistrate, the Roman magistrate at that time was Gallio, who was the proconsul. And he was of this whole region around Corinth. So he was brought before Gallio in the tribunal, and the Gallio inscription, and Gallio basically said, that's religious stuff. That doesn't have any, your debate doesn't have anything to do with me. You're debating religious matters. Get out of my court. And so he dismissed the whole case. and so Paul didn't have to suffer any because of that. But anyway, we learned the Galileo inscription has 9 fragments. It's a group of 9 fragments that was discovered at Delphi, Greece, and it was written by the Emperor Claudius. And in this letter, he references Julius Gallio, my friend and the proconsul. And there's an exact dating for this that allows us to date. We know when he was proconsul. He was proconsul. They served for 1 year, from AD 51 to AD 52. And so Paul was in Corinth at that period of time. So we can date that event, and that's very, very helpful for us. So we can, next slide, please. So here's the Galileo inscription, the writing on it there, or at least one of the pieces. And from this we can date Paul's Corinthian visit as AD 51 to 52. And from this we can date much of the rest of Paul's history, and even a lot of the history of the early church. So this is one of the most important dating events for dating the Old Testament, and when the things took place that's been available to us was this discovery of the Galileo inscription at Delphi. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is the last one here. This is the temple warning inscription. So the temple had this outer court of the Gentiles, and no Gentile could go inside to the inner part of the temple, and they only went in on penalty of death. And so Josephus describes the signs in the temple that warned people, Gentiles, not to go in. And it said this: no foreigner is to enter within the railing and enclosure around the temple, and whoever is caught will be responsible to himself for his subsequent death. And so in 1871, a French archaeologist, he found a limestone slab in the temple area with this inscription. And so it confirms, well, let's go on to the next slide. So here's the inscription that they found, that the French archaeologists found about this death sentence for any Gentile going in the inner courts of the temple. And so it confirms what takes place in Acts 21, where Paul is accused of taking a Gentile into the inner court, and he's almost killed by the Jewish mob for doing that. But we see that here's archaeological confirmation of all that. And maybe, this is an interesting idea, maybe when Paul talks about the dividing wall between the Gentiles and the Jews in Ephesians 2, maybe he has in his mind the reference of the temple and of this inscription. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the John Rylands fragment. We're just about through here. This is the John Rylands fragment. It's the oldest bit of New Testament text that we have, dating back to 125 to 175. It's from the Gospel of John, and it shows us that as early as 50 to 75 years after all this was written, it's being circulated. It's in Egypt, and people there know it. And so it confirms that the Scriptures indeed were ancient texts that were written very close to the time of the life of Jesus, not something that was put together later. So this is important for the historical text of the Bible, and indeed that it is very old and very accurate. Okay, last slide, please. Okay, so we'll skip this. Go to the next slide. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so we'll close with this. This is the archaeologist Dr. Scott Stripling, and I just want to close with what he says. After 150 years of archaeology in Israel, hundreds of synchronisms or connections between the material culture and the biblical text have been established. At this point, it takes more faith to believe that the Bible is not true than it does to believe that the Bible is true. Good words to close with. That's it. Thank you.